It was a calm, uneventful morning at the Hillside Police Station in the heart of Texas. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft orange hue across the parking lot. Inside, Sergeant Mike Peterson sat at his desk, slowly sipping lukewarm coffee while flipping through a stack of routine reports. The silence was almost too still, typical for a small town where nothing much ever happened. But that quiet was suddenly broken by a sound that made him pause. A bark. Not the usual distant bark echoing through the streets, but one that was sharp, persistent, and oddly urgent. Mike furrowed his brow and glanced toward the entrance, listening. At first, he shrugged it off. Stray dogs were common in town, but the barking continued, almost like someone was pleading for help. Curiosity finally got the better of him. Mike stood and walked to the front door, not expecting anything unusual, but when he opened it, he froze. Standing there, panting heavily and eyes wide with panic, was a golden retriever. Between her teeth, she held a tiny, limp puppy. Her body trembled with exhaustion, yet there was a kind of determined urgency in her gaze. Mike slowly crouched down, speaking gently. "Hey girl, what's going on?" The dog, later named Harley, carefully placed the puppy at his feet and looked up at him with what felt like a silent cry for help. Then, before he could react, she turned and ran back down the road. Mike was stunned. He instinctively called over Officer Sarah Mills, who came rushing to the door. Together, they stared at the fragile pup on the concrete, trying to piece together what had just happened. "I think she's coming back," Mike murmured, still staring down the street. And she did. Moments later, Harley returned, this time with another puppy clutched gently in her mouth. Then another. And another. Each trip she made back to the station became more labored, her steps slower, her breathing heavier. On the fifth trip, she stumbled through the doors, barely able to stand. Sarah reached out to comfort her, but Harley whimpered as if torn between collapsing and going back out one more time. That's when Sarah grabbed her coat and looked at Mike. "Something's not right. We have to follow her." Mike didn't hesitate. "I agree. This isn't normal." They loaded the shivering puppies into the back seat of their patrol car and took off behind Harley, who, despite her exhaustion, led them down the road with unwavering purpose. As they left the town behind and drove deeper into the outskirts, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. Whatever had driven this dog to bring her puppies to the police station, it had to be something serious, something she couldn't face alone. Harley didn't stop to rest. Even with her body shaking and her breath ragged, she kept moving with desperate energy, leading the patrol car through streets that quickly turned from familiar neighborhoods into overgrown paths at the edge of town. Mike drove slowly behind her, careful not to lose sight of her golden fur weaving through the bushes. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, glancing at the puppies in the back, small, curled-up balls of fur, still trembling from the cold. "If she came to us," Mike said, breaking the heavy silence, "it's because there was no one else. She must have known we were her only shot." Sarah didn't say anything at first, just nodded while staring out the window. As the car rolled deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier. The paved road gave way to gravel and dirt, and even the GPS lost signal. Then, Harley came to a sudden stop in front of what looked like an old, forgotten cabin tucked behind thick trees and tall grass. Both officers stepped out of the car cautiously, their boots crunching against leaves and twigs. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, peeling paint, broken windows, and an eerie silence hanging in the air. Harley stood in front of the door, her tail low and her ears pulled back. She let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the woods, a sound that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand on end. "She brought us here for a reason," Sarah said, resting her hand near her holster. Harley nudged the door open with her snout, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell hit them immediately: mold, decay, and something else, something far worse. Mike clicked on his flashlight and led the way inside, motioning for Sarah to stay close. The cabin was a mess. Furniture was overturned, pieces of fabric were draped from the walls, and everything was coated in a layer of dust. But Harley wasn't looking at the mess. She bolted straight toward a pile of old blankets in the center of the room and began digging frantically with her paws. Sarah rushed over, only to freeze mid-step. Beneath the blanket, barely breathing and ice-cold to the touch, was a sixth puppy. Its tiny chest rose and fell so faintly it was almost impossible to see. Harley whined and licked the pup, trying to warm it. "He's alive," Sarah whispered, her voice catching in her throat. But barely. She wrapped the puppy in her coat, holding him close to her chest while Harley stayed by her side, watching every move with pleading eyes. Mike continued to scan the room. something about it gnawing at him. In a dark corner, his flashlight caught something odd: a dusty dog collar, a frayed rope, and a piece of paper half buried in the dirt. He picked it up carefully. Most of it was smeared and unreadable, but one sentence stood out in shaky handwriting. "They can't find out." He turned to Sarah, his face pale. "I think there's more to this place than we thought." She stared at the note, then down at the sick puppy in her arms. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but one thing was clear: Harley hadn't just come to save her puppies. She had come to reveal something much darker. The drive back to the station was filled with a heavy, uneasy silence. Harley curled in the back seat with her puppies, her eyes flicking between the fragile little bodies and the road ahead. The weakest pup was wrapped tightly in Sarah's jacket, cradled in her arms as if letting go even for a second would cost him his life. His breathing was shallow, barely there. The moment they saw the vet clinic lights appear in the distance, Sarah whispered a quick prayer under her breath. As soon as Mike parked the squad car, she jumped out, Harley right on her heels. Inside, Dr. Ellen Foster, the on-call veterinarian, met them at the door. The concern on her face deepened the moment she saw the limp puppy in Sarah's arms. "He's in bad shape," Sarah said, handing him over. "Please do what you can." Ellen nodded, already rushing the little one into the back room. Harley tried to follow, letting out a low, anxious bark, but Sarah gently held her back. "Easy, girl. She's helping him." While Ellen worked, Mike leaned against the squad car outside, lost in thought. He couldn't stop replaying everything they'd seen: the strange cabin, the frantic digging, the cryptic note. There was something dark lingering behind it all, and it didn't feel like coincidence. Just then, his phone buzzed. One of the officers from the station was on the line, voice tense. "Mike, are you still near the cabin?" "No, we're at the clinic." "Why?" The reply made his heart drop. "We went back to take a second look. There were tracks, not just human, dog tracks, big ones, leading straight into the forest. Something's out there." Mike looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes as she walked back toward him. Even before he said anything, she could tell from his expression that things had just taken another turn. Harley, still sitting near the car, let out a sharp bark as if she, too, felt the shift. "We're going back," Mike said, grabbing the keys. Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing at the clinic doors, but when she looked back at Harley, the decision was clear. "Then we go prepared." The road to the cabin felt different this time, darker, heavier. The forest loomed on either side, the patrol car's headlights slicing through the shadows. Harley sat alert in the back seat, her ears perked, eyes fixed on the night beyond the window. Neither officer spoke, but both felt it. Whatever they had stumbled into, it was just beginning. When they reached the cabin, something was off. The front door, which had been slightly ajar before, now swung wide open in the wind. Mike cut the engine. "Stay close," he said. Flashlights in hand, they stepped out. Harley darted ahead of them, her movements sharp and purposeful. Inside, the scene had changed. The blanket in the middle of the floor was gone, replaced by a strange symbol scratched into the wood, a rough circle surrounded by claw marks. Mike crouched, shining his light over it. This wasn't here before. Sarah's heart pounded as she scanned the room. Harley started growling low in her throat. Then came the sound that made them both freeze. A distant bark, not from Harley, but from somewhere deep in the woods. Another bark followed, then another. "We're not alone," Sarah whispered, raising her flashlight toward the window. Harley stood firm beside them, growling louder now, protective and unshaken. Mike stared at the symbol one last time before speaking, his voice low. "Whatever this is, it's not good, and I don't think it's over." Back at the station, the air felt heavier than before. Mike sat at the edge of his desk, staring at the crumpled note they had found in the cabin. "They can't find out." The words played over and over in his mind like a bad echo. Across the room, Sarah was pinning photos and sketches onto a bulletin board. The cabin, the symbols, the footprints. Every detail was a piece of something bigger, and none of it made sense yet. But what haunted both of them most was Harley. She wasn't just some stray who'd stumbled into their lives. She had guided them deliberately, insistently, right into the heart of something dark. "There's no way she came to us by accident," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Mike nodded, arms crossed tightly, eyes still locked on the paper. Whoever left this note knew those puppies were in danger. The question is, from who? Just then, one of the younger officers entered the room holding a manila file. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing it to Mike. "We pulled some old case files from a few years back. illegal dogfighting, remote properties. No charges stuck, but one name kept coming up: Richard Coleman. Disappeared before we could bring him in. Mike flipped through the files slowly. Coleman's name was there, along with notes about animal injuries, suspicious neighbors, and a property that had since been sold to a shell company. No listed owner, the officer added. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, scanning the documents. A chill ran down her spine. What if this whole setup, the cabin, the dogs, the collars, it's all part of something bigger? Organized, hidden. She turned and looked at Harley, who was lying quietly in the corner, her head resting between her paws, eyes locked on the door as if waiting for something. What if she escaped from that place? And now she's trying to take us back? A sudden bark from Harley snapped everyone's attention. The phone on Mike's desk rang at the same time, and he answered immediately. On the other end, another officer's voice came through, tight with urgency. It's the vet clinic. There's been a break-in. Mike stood straight, grabbing his jacket. Sarah's eyes widened. What happened? She asked. Puppies are missing, the voice replied. And the vet said a man in a mask left a note. That was all it took. Within minutes, they were back in the squad car, sirens off but lights flashing as they sped through the dark streets. When they arrived, the clinic looked like a war zone. Glass was shattered, furniture overturned, papers everywhere. The vet, shaken and pale, met them at the door. He took more puppies, he whispered. In his hand was another note, "Don't interfere." Mike's jaw clenched. He's watching us, he said. Harley was already sniffing near the back entrance, barking sharply. Sarah ran over to her and spotted prints in the mud leading away from the building and vanishing at the pavement. He knew exactly where to go, she muttered. As they regrouped, a new truth settled over them. This wasn't just about one cabin or even one man. Someone was orchestrating all of it, hiding behind shadows, pulling strings. And Harley, somehow, had found her way to them, not just to save her puppies, but to pull back the curtain on something much darker. The tech team arrived at the veterinary clinic just after dawn, their equipment still covered in dew as they began pulling security footage from the damaged system. Inside, the clinic was still a mess. Shattered glass crunched underfoot, and overturned chairs were scattered across the floor. Sarah stood near the front desk, holding the latest note in her gloved hand. Don't interfere. The words were printed in all caps, hurried and smudged with what looked like dirt. Dr. Foster, the vet, hovered nearby, visibly shaken. They knew exactly what they were looking for, she said softly. They didn't touch the meds or the cash drawer. They came for the dogs, and they knew where we kept them. Mike was near the side entrance, crouched beside a torn piece of cloth caught on the doorknob. There was dried blood on it. Someone's hurt, he said, holding it up with a grim expression. This could be our lead. Harley, meanwhile, paced the room restlessly, stopping every few feet to sniff the floor or bark toward the back alley. She was agitated more than before, and it felt like she was trying to tell them something important. Sarah followed Harley outside, where paw prints and boot tracks trailed through the wet dirt, only to vanish on the asphalt. He knew what he was doing, she muttered. He planned this. Harley continued barking, running in small circles as if trying to pick up a scent. Sarah knelt down and gently placed her hand on the dog's back. You knew they weren't safe here, didn't you? She whispered. Harley let out a low whine, nudging her nose toward the trees at the end of the lot. Back inside, the techs had finished extracting the footage and were playing it back on a small monitor. The grainy black and white video showed a masked figure breaking in through the rear entrance. He moved with precision, no hesitation, no wasted motion. He headed straight for the holding area, where several of the rescued puppies were resting. They watched as he loaded a transport crate with the whimpering pups, pausing only once. In the final frame, just before disappearing from view, he turned and looked directly into the camera. His face was hidden, but his eyes were chilling, focused, sharp, and unapologetically confident. The room went silent as the video ended. Mike slowly stood, his fists clenched. He's not just sending a message, he said. He's warning us. He knows we're close. Sarah didn't say anything right away. She looked over at Harley, who was now sitting by the clinic's front window, staring out into the daylight. There was something in the dog's stillness that felt intentional, like she was waiting. She knows where he'll go next, Sarah said quietly. She's not just reacting, she's guiding us. Mike nodded. Then we follow her lead. But this time, we go in ready for whatever's waiting. As they left the clinic, Sarah carried the few remaining puppies back to the squad car, placing them carefully in the back seat. Harley followed, climbing in beside them, still alert. The ride back to the station was tense. Every streetlight, every passing shadow felt like it might hold a clue or a threat. But one thing was certain now. The man behind this wasn't just trying to hide. He was playing a game, and Harley had just forced his hand. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the cabin again, and this time, they weren't alone. Officers Baker and Jenny had joined them, flashlights in hand and expressions tight with focus. The wind rustled through the trees like a warning, and the old wooden door creaked as it swung slowly open. Inside, the space felt different, heavier, like the air itself had absorbed the fear and tension. The symbol that had been crudely scratched into the floor before was now replaced with something darker. In the center of the room, dried blood had been used to draw a new, more intricate circle. Next to it sat a carefully folded piece of fabric, stained and unmistakably deliberate. Harley paced the room anxiously, her growls low and constant. Then, as if driven by instinct, she ran to a corner and began digging into the dirt with frantic urgency. Mike dropped beside her, clearing away the earth. Beneath it, they found a wooden box, filled with old collars, rusted tags, and faded photographs of dogs with notes scribbled in the margins, some tagged as fighters, others marked lost. Sarah flipped through a notebook found inside the box. Most pages were filled with sketches, disconnected ramblings, and diagrams. But one page stood out. It read in shaky handwriting, "They are always watching. Protect them at all costs." Just as she read the last words aloud, a sound from outside made everyone freeze. A branch snapped, then another. The officers raised their weapons, flashlights sweeping across the windows. Harley stood frozen, staring at the darkness outside, her body tense. A faint light flickered in the distance, bouncing between the trees. And then, from the shadows, a man emerged, hooded, calm, holding a chain in one hand. "I warned you not to interfere," he said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "They need to be protected, from people like you." Before they could speak, he let out a sharp whistle, and from the woods, glowing eyes began to appear. Dozens of them. Thin, wild-looking dogs stepped into view, silent and waiting, but Harley didn't back down. She placed herself between the officers and the pack, barking fiercely. For a tense moment, everything stood still until the man disappeared into the trees, and with another whistle, the dogs followed. They didn't chase him, not yet. Instead, they stood there, surrounded by silence, the forest pressing in around them. Mike finally broke it with a heavy breath. "He's not done." Sarah nodded slowly, glancing down at Harley, who had returned to her side, tired but unbroken. "She led us to all of this. She didn't just want to save her puppies, she wanted us to see what was really happening." They left the woods that night with more questions than answers, but one thing had become painfully clear. Someone had been using, abusing, and discarding these dogs in secret. Harley, a dog with no voice and nothing but instinct, had done what no human had she exposed it. And maybe that's the most powerful part of this story. In a world where animals are too often seen as disposable, Harley reminded us that they feel, they fight, and they protect just like we do. Her courage forced open a door most people would rather leave closed. And through that door, we saw truth, pain, and the quiet bravery of a mother who refused to give up. It's easy to overlook suffering when it's silent. But Harley's story shows us that sometimes the ones with no voice speak the loudest if we're willing to listen. As dawn approached, the weight of the night's discovery hung heavily over the station. Mike, Sarah, and the other officers gathered in the small conference room, now cluttered with maps, photos, and evidence from the cabin and the vet clinic. Everyone looked exhausted, but no one could rest, not while the masked man was still out there, and not while they still didn't know what he was planning next. Harley lay curled up beneath the table, her head resting on her front paws, her body pressed protectively against the surviving puppies. Even in her rest, she stayed alert. The images from the last encounter of the pack of starved dogs, the hooded figure with the chain, and those strange symbols drawn in blood had left a chill in the air no one could shake. "He's not just some animal abuser," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "He's organized, he's watching us, and he's sending a message with every move." They now had reason to believe the man was part of a larger network, possibly connected to illegal dog fighting rings or something even more sinister. The notebook from the box at the cabin had pages filled with coded language, hand-drawn diagrams, and references to training grounds and tests. Some pages had names crossed out, others just had numbers. But one phrase kept appearing again and again: "Only the strong survive." It wasn't just about cruelty, it was about ideology. A twisted belief system where these dogs were treated as tools, forced into savagery, and discarded if they didn't meet the standard. Mike's voice was low, filled with disgust. He thinks he's doing something righteous, like he's creating warriors, not victims. Across the room, Harley suddenly lifted her head. She stared at the door, ears perked. Before anyone could react, someone knocked. It was Officer Jenny. She stepped in with a tablet in her hands. "We analyzed the footage again. Look at this." She tapped the screen, and the paused video showed a reflection in the clinic's broken glass just for a split second. The hooded man's truck. The plate was partially visible. By mid-morning, they had traced the vehicle to an abandoned property 2 counties over, registered under the same shell company linked to Richard Coleman's former land. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. They decided to move fast. Mike, Sarah, Jenny, and Baker prepared to head out, this time with backup and tactical support. As they packed gear into the vehicles, Harley began pacing near the back door of the station, clearly agitated. When Sarah opened the car, Harley jumped in on her own, sitting squarely beside the crate holding her pups. "She knows," Sarah said softly. "She wants to go." Mike didn't hesitate. "Then she's going. She's the reason we've come this far." With sirens off and adrenaline high, the team hit the road toward the new location. Trees blurred past the windows, and tension filled every mile. No one spoke, but each of them understood. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a confrontation. A mother dog had started something no one expected, and now they were all about to finish it.